Hello, and welcome to Eavesdropping at the Movies. I'm Mike.
And I'm Jose.
Blade Runner 2049.
Yes, you said you could never get into the original one, that you really don't like it, that it's so dull.
I've watched the original a couple of times, and I tried to watch it again the other day when we booked the tickets for this. I liked it more the other day.
Uh-huh.
I respected its visual style an awful lot more.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose it's kind of its tone and its pace. I think actually I was underestimating it when I first saw it, but I still think it's boring, basically. Right. Unfortunately, and that's actually a real problem, particularly for a police procedural, which is what it is for quite a lot of it. It's a detective story at heart. Generically, it's a detective story. It's got a lot of other stuff on top of that, but actually the detective story aspect is not gripping.
Yes,
and I find the rest of it boring on top of that. That's just, but it's essentially. It's not a bad film, it's just not my cup of tea.
Oh, no, I was wondering when you said that, whether it's just that I mean, the difference between Blade Runner and now, the original Blade Runner and now, is almost the same as between Casablanca and Blade Runner.
Mm.
Yeah, so, you know...
Yeah, we're 1982, so...
Yeah, and, you know, Casablanca is 1942, and the film is aping mid-40s styles of dress and haircuts, the original Blade Runner, right? It's referencing those Humphrey Bogart films of the mid-40s. So actually, it's very interesting that, you know, the difference between 1982 and now is 35 years.
Yeah.
Right? So there's almost like the same number of years difference between this film and the original and the films and the style of film it's referencing. And I'm only mentioning that because I think you're right about the procedural, which is why I think the film was a failure at the box office. But I think what you're missing, you know, what got people so gripped and culty and interested in the film was that the questions that it was asking about what it is to be human, you know, the connections between human and machines, kind of, you know, all of those were kind of new, you know, and they felt,
absolutely.
You know, whereas now they're all
It's a film that's very much of its time in some respects.
Yeah. So, but those questions now, you know, every little B sci-fi film has made them. So I think actually that element of shock of the new, of taking something seriously that, you know, heretofore hadn't. Also of being part of a larger web. I'm thinking of, you know, the William Gibson Neuromancer novel and things like that. You know, that's kind of like hard to recapture. On the other hand, you know, it does still seem to grip students quite, you know. So anyway, since you didn't like the original,
one other thing about it which is important, I think, to mention, as to a reason that I've never been gripped or it's never turned me on the original, is that the conversation around it is so heavily dominated by the question of whether Deckard is a replicant or not.
Yes,
whether he's an android and doesn't know it, or whether he's a human. And I've never, although I think it is interesting in some respects. I've never found it to be gripping enough. I think the film... I don't actually think the film is that ambiguous about it, although it depends on which of the 10 versions of it that you see, because there's always little minute detail differences. I think there's this thing about the unicorn dream, and then the other police officer, Gaff, leaves a unicorn origami thing.
Yes.
So that to me is like the kind of one unassailable bit of evidence that says he is a replicant. For me, at least. That's what it always was. And I kind of thought, this isn't an ambiguous question. It's not ambiguous enough. And actually, the other things about the film are so much more interesting, but no one talks about them. This whole question is he a replicant or not? I've never found that to be an important enough question or an interesting enough question, and it's all people seem to think about.
Right. Well, in any case, now in the new version we have the answer. So
yeah, now it's very clear. Well, Ridley Scott always said as well. He always, well, I don't know, always, but eventually when he got sick of the question, maybe he said he's a replicant, and it's just that's the way it is, as far as I see it. Which is not to say that, like, you know, the author's answer is the answer, but he gave you what he thought, and he never. Well, in other words, he was never saying, "I meant this to be a question that you couldn't answer."
My feeling right now, and we've just seen it, like, you know, about 10 minutes ago, is that I love this movie more than any Ridley Scott film I've ever seen.
We should clarify that it's not directed by Ridley Scott. It's produced, obviously. It's directed by Denis Villeneuve.
That was the point I was...
Who did Arrival in Sicario. You're right. I think it's absolutely extraordinary. I went in with low expectations because I thought I do like Denis Villeneuve, but I think he has the capacity to be extremely dreary, and I find the original Blade Runner extremely dreary. So I went to this thinking, what is this combination going to be? And actually, it's not dreary. It's slow and it's atmospheric, and it has a command of tone that is. It is slow, but in a way that's so confident.
Let's find another word, because slow is a real turn-off. People equate slow with boring.
Okay.
And I think that this is contemplative in a way, right? Like, I mean, I didn't look at my watch once.
No.
Right? You're completely gripped and interested by everything that's going on screen, and you lose track of time.
It's over 2.5 hours long.
Yeah. And it,
and it feels like it.
I didn't feel like it.
It doesn't feel like it's dragging, but you sense that there's a lot of time passing. I think
I think it's a contemplative film. There's a lot going on, right? And there's a lot going on that's interesting, and it's got some of the most beautiful visuals I have ever seen in cinema. I mean, Roger Deakins' cinematography is so interesting. It's so beautifully done. There's so many scenes that stand out, and actually, that from minor things to the way that black people are lit in the film, to actually the huge long shot of the children being enslaved, right, which was just like absolutely perfectly lit. You could see kind of.
I wanted to pick up on the lighting and the cinematography. Not only did I think it was one of the most beautiful films I've ever seen in the way it's shot and the visual design, but the lighting. I have so much. A problem actually I had with Arrival was I was just going, where are the lights? Turn on the lights. This is dull and dark. And this is a film that is bathed in darkness, but you can see everything.
Yes,
it has it's conveying darkness and shadows, but you're never fighting to actually see things.
Yes.
It's incredible.
It's a film that's encased in dust, right? So the setting is a futuristic Los Angeles that's just encased in dust, basically, right? So that in itself has its own beauty, right? But then what happens is, that the light that comes through is like a kind of light going through a fog. So there are all these different types of orange tones, right?
Yeah, like sunsets.
Yeah, like sunsets that look like sunsets, but really it's kind of like...
Well, the light's kind of harsh and diffuse at the same time. It'll kind of sort of strike a wall coming through a window, and there'll be high contrast between that and the shadows around it, but yet it's kind of got these soft edges.
Yes.
So it's this hazy feel to it.
Yes. I found it so beautiful, and actually not just in terms of the lighting, because the whole thing about some of those images, that really stand out for you, that, like the moment where Joe, the Ryan Gosling character, holds this little flower, this little yellow flower that he picks up at the base of a tree, right? And so you have like this huge close-up of him kind of almost caressing this flower, right? It's just so both beautiful and meaningful. Yeah, kind of there's a conceptualization to these images. It's not just kind of the filming of them, right? And there are all these recurring gestures of hands, right? And hands touching, and hands kind of not being able to touch, or kind of touching through an intermediary, either through a machine or, trying to touch through glass, or, the film is full of those gestures, right? That are then kind of beautifully lit and resonant and like so imaginative. The scene where...
The love scene.
Yeah, the love scene.
Unbelievable. You've never seen anything like it.
It's just conceptually kind of...
Well, it's like it's like Her, right? But one-upped.
Yes.
It's something else. I was not hugely gripped by Her, although I do respect it an awful lot. But this was a love scene which was very similar, where he's in love with a computerized woman, essentially a virtual woman.
Yes.
And then a surrogate is brought in, a prostitute in this case, to kind of embody the woman.
Yeah, to enable carnality.
Yeah.
Right.
But it's visually, it's on another level.
Yes. And I think what was interesting about that scene is that this machine has feelings and loves and cares, right? And that's the one thing that they can't cross over is the carnal aspect. She remains kind of like an electronic kind of, but she's got a personality and she's got a history and she loves, right?
It's actually taken for granted in this film that the robotic and electronic people do have this aspect to their lives. And actually, there's one point where the Blade Runner character, Joe, Ryan Gosling, is asked to retire, kill, essentially a kind of a human. It's a replicant that's supposed to have been born,
Yes.
which is a new development in replicants. And he says, I've never had to kill it, never had to retire anything that was born before.
Yes.
It has a soul.
Yes.
But it seems actually that the thing in the film which has the most soul is the thing that doesn't even have a body. It's a purely virtual construct.
I mean, I don't know, because it's very interesting that he uses the word soul there. Because actually, I mean, I think for me, the theme of the film is that anybody who has the capacity to love is human. Right? So actually what the film is saying is something kind of slightly other, or actually adding, or not adding, displacing this question that Ryan Gosling has. I've never, I suppose they have a soul because they're born rather than made. Well, actually, kind of, what the film does is something else. It's, kind of those who love are human, right? Kind of, and the film kind of shows, all those different ways of loving that all involve a kind of loneliness and distance and sacrifice and longing, right? Like kind of, so Deckard, I mean, he loves by having given them up completely so that they couldn't be traced, right? Kind of Ryan Gosling and his virtual, girl can, I mean, the love is their feelings, right? And they kind of have a history of going through them, but actually they can only really connect through an intermediary. The Deckard, when he finally meets his child, can only do so through glass, right? Like, I find that the way that the film visualizes both feeling and also kind of the fact that we're all alone, that we're always at a remove, that we're always trying to connect. Yeah, but that there's a gap in between. I thought that was so moving and beautiful, really. Yeah,
the world prevents them from being able to do so, but they kind of...
They strive.
They strive and they fight.
Yeah.
And it's a kind of... It's like a Jurassic Park thing. Life finds a way.
Yes. I thought the final image of Ryan Gosling expiring in the snow, right? Like, having fought for something bigger than himself, right? He finds something kind of worth dying for.
Dying for the right cause is brought up in the film, and that kind of becomes something he believes in.
Yes. I thought, but that image, right, of him sitting down, and actually it's an image full of disappointment, because, I mean, throughout the film, he thinks he's Deckard's child, and actually, you find yourself hoping that it would be so neat, and then kind of the film offers twists.
I thought it would be too neat, actually. I thought it would, and I didn't think it would be disappointing if he had been, but I hoped he wouldn't be. That would have been too neat.
I think you're right. I agree. It would have been too neat, and actually the film handles it beautifully.
Yeah.
But that image of him expiring on the snow, just like, stretching his body on these cement stairs, with just snow falling on him. It's like so beautiful. Yeah. And it's kind of, and actually part of the message there, he's led a life worth living, right? Even at the moment where he expires. I thought that was terrific.
Because the moment he expires, the connection between Deckard and his daughter is being remade.
Yes.
Or made for the first time.
Yes, and actually, that means that things can happen, and a redefinition of what it is to be human has changed.
Yeah. It's fucking wonderful, man.
So what other elements?
I mean, I'm so glad that I went in with such low expectations, but even if my expectations had been high, they would have been exceeded.
Uh-huh.
I was just totally taken by it.
So what other elements grabbed your attention?
I loved the plotting of it, actually, and the storytelling. There were moments where... There was one or two moments in the procedural aspect. Again, this begins with the procedural, where he's tracking down particular replicants and following clues and so on, which works wonderfully. There were moments in it where things didn't seem to quite make sense. Why was he going off to a certain location? I don't remember exactly what the clue was that led him there, and I still think one or two of those might be not explained well enough. But what it then does is it brings up this idea that there is a replicant child that has been born, which isn't supposed to happen. This needs to be covered up. They need to be eliminated. He then begins to believe, because this was supposed to have happened about 28, 29 years ago, and he's about that age. He begins to believe that it's him. And you are led down the garden path very fairly. The film never tells you explicitly this is what's going on, nor does it dissuade you from it. It just gives you the right levels of information. It doesn't lie to you. And then when the revelation comes out that it's not him and it's this girl instead that he's encountered along the way, this girl who builds dreams for androids, it makes perfect sense. And everything slots into place. And actually, there was a couple of questions that I had, which I hoped would be resolved by the end, because I thought these questions, if they're not resolved, I'm going to feel really disappointed because they haven't. But
so what were those questions?
Well, there was a question particularly about his dreams. So Joe's boss, Robin Wright, who's wonderful, says, "Tell me a memory that you have." And he says, I don't have memories, they're implanted. So he's a replicant, and we know that from the start. So he says, this memory isn't real, but here it is. And it's a memory of him in this kind of workhouse when he's a young boy, sort of 10 years old, being chased by some other boys because he has this little wooden horse. And he says, this is the only thing of mine. And so I had to hide it. And he hides it behind this furnace, and then he gets beaten up. But he never reveals where it is. Later on in the film, he is led to this workhouse by the trail of clues, and he recognises it, and so he takes a moment for himself and he walks off and sees this furnace, and it's an unbelievable moment. And again, it's drawn out and it feels huge because this is epic. Like, is he going to find this carved wooden horse? So is this going to turn out to be real? What is going on? And he eventually finds it. So then this question is, what? So he must be Deckard's son. Then he must have been born to have actually had this memory, because the wooden horse is there. It wasn't an implanted memory. This is real. He meets the girl who makes memories for robots, and she sort of actually she analyzes this memory of his essentially. And she says, this really happened. I found that slightly disappointing, and I still think actually this only the film hasn't quite answered. I think what the question should be is, was this someone else's real memory that was put in my head?
I think the film actually...
he does ask, but then what she says is, this is someone's real memory.
Well, I thought
not that it's your real memory.
Exactly. Which keeps the film honest, right? Because actually her saying... this is a real memory, rather than saying this is your real memory. Right.
The film is not lying about it. It's not saying that this is your real memory, because that would be a lie. But the fact that she says this memory is real, this happened. The film plays it as this huge moment that proves he must essentially
he must be
Deckard's son, which the film isn't telling you that, but the film's playing it as this huge revelatory moment. But we already know that the memory is real because we found this horse.
Yes.
So that scene, that particular line of dialogue, which is the climax of that scene, is giving you no additional information.
Well, but
it's just confirming that this actually happened.
No, it's actually kind of adding an element of tension, even as it is giving the impression of a revelation, which I thought was really beautifully handled, because so on the one hand, Joe, this is a kind of confirmation that he is that child who's been born of replicants. But actually, the way that she phrases it made me kind of doubt that possibility. So, on the one hand, you accept it, but on the one hand, you acknowledge that it's not a final answer, that there could be a twist on it. So I thought that was very cleverly done.
It may be up to a personal interpretation, because I felt that what that scene was doing was giving you this kind of ultimate nudge in that direction without going so far as to lie to you. And I don't think it was... I don't think it was asking you to question it, which I think you will later do. But at the moment, I'm thinking this scene is acting as though it's a revelation, but it's simply confirming something we already knew.
Yeah.
Maybe it is implying that Joe is only hearing what he wants to hear. Maybe that's to be. Maybe I should be fair to it and say that actually it's more from his point of view, that the emotion of that scene is from inside his head. He's hearing what he believes is a confirmation, but he's hearing what he wants to hear. Maybe I don't know. I felt a little shortchanged by that moment because I thought,
I didn't. I saw an ambiguity there.
That's it's one moment in a film that is full of
the film is
detail
full,
and character
and also very, very, very much acknowledging its root source, not only through bringing in the James Edward Olmos character and using footage of the original film of Sean Young playing Rachel, but actually there were some things that I thought were just very subtle but magnificent. So there's a moment where Ryan Gosling does this gesture with his hands, which is almost identical to Rutger Hauer. That moment in the rooftop where he's explaining to Harrison Ford, about his desire to live. He does this thing with his hand, and Ryan Gosling reproduces that. I thought it was also very interesting that the prostitute real person is dressed very much like Daryl Hannah in the original film. Yeah, that orange wiggy type hair. Yeah, so and not to speak of the Vangelis music, right, that kind of recurs throughout the film. I think there are threads of the first film, or there are echoes of in Blade Runner 2049 of the first film, but they're only echoes, right? So you see a kind of a continuity, but it's not made overt or manifest, or you're not bludgeoned with it. I thought it was very, very subtle, but very beautiful. If you've seen the film, you recognize it. Really, it
has a relationship with its own history that is very delicate and very considered, and it's not. Because I mean, what are the odds? Do you think that a good proportion of the audience has not seen the original Blade Runner?
I don't know. I mean, there are always those odds. I mean, I was in a class today where only 10% of the people knew who Marlene Dietrich was. So my impression is that it's a big cult film. It's never been out of print. It's always available on video, or on DVD or digitally. It's been referenced in so many ways that I just think it's one of those cult films, that if you're a teenager, you've seen, right? And I think it'll be interesting to see what the box office is, because actually that will tell. Because if this film that was a flop in 1982 all of a sudden has a massive opening weekend, actually it's because of those people who are familiar with the original. So, and my impression is that, a great number of people are familiar with the original.
Yeah. I think its relationship with its predecessor is it's convincing and it feels natural. It feels like there has been no effort to force things in that were in the original. I mean, like you say, Gaff shows up, who is the guy who makes the origami in the first film, and he just shows up for a scene just to point you in the right direction. And it's lovely to see him, and he's gone. So, but even then, it's not forced in. It's not crowbarred in. He has a purpose and he has a reason to be there. These clips that are played from the original film they're put in as sort of audio logs. The idea that everything back then was just being recorded. Everything, there's a robot in every room recording everything, and they all exist. Again, this feels very natural. And then the way that the story develops, it's not doing, for instance, what The Force Awakens did, which is saying the structure of the film from 40 years ago, let's repeat it, and just put new characters in. It goes in a completely different direction. I had no idea what the story would be doing.
It's a great story.
Actually, I hated the trailer because the trailer said something about he's got an army. The villain in this film was supposed to have an army in the trailer. And I thought, oh, great, this is going to be crap. This is what, an army of robots? This doesn't show up in the film. The film is totally something else. It's this story about all of a sudden the replicants can do something different, and that poses a new challenge and a new set of problems for what they're what their identity is, what they mean to society, how they operate, and what their status is, and are they living things? It asks a lot of the same sort of questions as the original film does, but it brings in this completely original plot.
And also, I think it evokes different feelings.
Yeah.
You know, which I think the original film did so in this kind of movie way, right? So Harrison Ford is wearing his raincoat and he's in this Chinatown thing in the rain, and it's actually meant to evoke, 1940s films. But actually, what this film does, which I think is vastly superior, is the whole beginning of the film, the whole first section of the film, you feel Ryan Gosling's loneliness like an ache, right? He is a machine. He lives this terrible life where, he works all the time, he gets shot at, he returns to an empty apartment, right, where kind of people are abusing him for being a machine, and he's got this virtual reality girlfriend for company.
He has virtual reality food.
And he has
this kind
food.
of gruel in a bowl
Right.
that has this VR beautiful dinner put on top of it.
Yeah, so that sense of disconnectedness, of alienation, of life barely being worth living, of being like completely shut down. The film evokes that so beautifully. And also the striving to move away from that, to connect, even if it is only to a virtual reality machine, right? Like, I thought that was all, you feel it. Whereas, like, I never felt that in the original. Like, in the original, you feel it referenced, but you don't, the film itself doesn't create that feeling in you. Right,
he externalizes nothing. Ryan Gosling. He has this stoic, unmoving demeanor.
Yes,
which partly is there to help you believe that he's a robot, which he is. But, but and actually, he just internalizes everything. He has no reason to express anything. Any emotion visually, who's going to respond to it?
Yes. And actually, I think maybe the casting is interesting, because I think maybe that's why there were so many questions around Deckard, because Harrison Ford is the least, if I were to build like a robot, you would build a Ryan Gosling, right? Like,
Harrison Ford's a cool guy.
Harrison Ford is too angry and pissed off at the world and ornery to be a machine, right? Like, you would have built something more docile, more obedient, more,
The perfect movie robot was always Arnold Schwarzenegger in Terminator 2, because he can't even act.
Yes.
At least Ryan Gosling can act like he can't act.
Yeah, well, more is required of these of him here, right? So on the one hand, there's this kind of blankness and perfection, and actually I thought that was the beauty of his performance, that as the film unfolds, that blankness gets fleshed in and and imbued with feeling and desire and want and lack, right?
There are these moments of contrast where just very occasionally a loud moment in this sea of silence, where he at one point he screams, and is from it's a payoff to an hour and a half of build-up where there's been very little show of emotion from him. It erupts in this one particular moment. He changes in that moment, and it means so much because you spent all this time without anything of that nature happening. If Harrison Ford, if there'd been a moment like that in the original film, it wouldn't have been nearly as significant.
It's so interesting, because in a way the whole narrative structure is Oedipal, in the sense that it's kind of it's a search for the father, and then it's a search to kill the father, right? Like, it's got all of those things there, but it's also kind of so sad, because it's at the moment that he discovers purpose and feeling and love, that's the moment that his life is over, really, Ryan Gosling.
In what way? The moment that he discovers love?
Yes, because the thing about him going to rescue Deckard rather than to kill him, is a moment of self-sacrifice. It is like a moment of love, right? So, I mean, he's already lost, the woman he loves, right? Yeah, the virtual reality.
You mean right at the very, very end, when Deckard's been taken by the corporation?
Right,
yes.
So he's found, he discovers that he has real feelings for his virtual reality girlfriend, right? Then, he finds a purpose in this kind of resistance type thing. And then actually you know, he discovers that he's willing to sacrifice himself, and you know, not only for the cause, but actually also for another, you know, which in this case is Deckard.
The cause is one of the weakest. Assuming you mean by the cause you mean the group of sort of resistant machines that show up.
I liked it.
Well, I didn't hate it, but they're in it so little. They show up in 2 scenes.
But that's what I liked about it, you know, that because the theme has to develop, right? Because otherwise, this thing about once people discover that a child can be born of machines, then, like, you know, there will be blood and dust and change, and it'll be a catastrophe of, you know, the world will absolutely radically change. Well, you know, you have to kind of indicate.
No, sure. Well, all I mean is that I'm not saying I wanted them to be in it more. I think the film would not have benefited from that, but I think that the way they were used was essentially they were used as they put a tracking device on him because one of them is the prostitute. So they notice him and they go to approach him. Their leader is, you know, tells the prostitutes to go after Ryan Gosling, put the tracking device on him. Later on, when they've tracked him, they pick him up and explain who they are, and so they're in essentially 2 scenes, and it's simply that they felt like plot devices. They didn't feel, although it is clear that there is a background to them and a history to this resistance. It's you're not given any sort of. There's no real flesh on those bones. They are plot devices. They're there to make a couple of plot things happen.
It's a plot device. It's really minimal, but I think it's really necessary, and for me it functions very well.
It is necessary.
The one thing I didn't like, or that presented a kind of niggle, you know, in what I think is otherwise like a great film, I'm uncomfortable with the way the women are represented in the film. It seems they're all either, you know, docile, love,
they're there to serve
robots,
with the exception of Robin Wright, who is in charge.
Well, actually there's 2 exceptions, because, you know, the other exception is Jared Leto's what does he call her?
His right hand woman.
I forget what her name is, but anyway, you know, so I think Robin Wright and this other robot are like the ninja aspects, you know, and then there's like, you know, varying degrees of, you know, sex slave robots, right? You know, from those that are kind of advertised in holograms, which my God, that's such beautiful imagery in the film as well.
And it's heartbreaking.
You know, to his virtual reality girlfriend, which all takes place in a way in the mind and through a shared history, really. But I kind of, that.
Well, the heartbreaking thing I mentioned is related to, because you see this relationship that he has with the virtual reality girlfriend, where they essentially really care for each other, and you really buy it. Then she's killed brutally in this weird way. Like, she's not. There is violence in the film, but this is just stamping on the electronic device within which she lives, which actually should have been a more devastating moment than it was. And I think it was undercut by the fact that when the woman does it, the right-hand woman, she has a quote-unquote snappy line. Yeah. She says, "We hope you're satisfied with your product."
Yes.
Because they're the people that sell it. And that undercuts the moment, for me anyway. But anyway, so you see the relationship, and then she's lost to him. And then as he crosses a bridge, this 100-foot tall version of her, holographic, bends down from one of these moving billboards. And that's heartbreaking, because it's, although you knew she was a commodity, it couldn't be more obvious than when she's 100 foot tall, staring you in the face, and has a slogan saying everything you want to see, everything you want to hear.
Yes, but actually what distinguishes them, I think what the film does so beautiful, is that even though they're the same model, they're not the same person.
Yeah.
You know, and actually what distinguishes, you know, one from the other is a shared history and feelings, right? Like, you know, or a shared history of feeling, love, So I thought that was just magnificent. Really, I think it's a great film.
But that is the moment where he heeds the message of the resistance. The film uses flashback and in a way that badly handled could be patronising, but actually I think it brings back it calls back to these earlier things very well, and actually I think it's justified. So that the film plays back over, in voiceover, the resistance leader telling him, "Do you want to die for the right cause?" or something like that. And that's at that moment where he sees his girlfriend, or the advertising version. That kind of, his relationship with her is the most important thing, and that's what motivates him to die for the right cause.
I want to mention a little bit about the performances, because I think one of the things that's so impressive about Villeneuve is how wonderful he is with actors. And actually, I thought this film was so interesting because the actors are wonderful, right? But then the film gives a visual dimension to their performance that is also wonderful, right? So I'm thinking here, like for example, the Jared Leto character, right? He only appears in two scenes, two brief scenes.
I felt he was a disappointment, not as a performer, but as a character. But that's a separate. Maybe we can come back to that.
I loved it, and obviously it also references the first film. But I was just thinking that the way his whole look is designed, right, and then how he's placed within the frame, is as much of the performance. Is as much responsible for the impact as what Jared Leto brings to it. And I felt the same way about the Ryan Gosling character, right? It's like the actor, there's a mise en scène of the performance which the actor is giving, right?
There's a visual aspect to the way in which the shot is composed around them and including them that is not, it's not simply saying like the set design is this and they're plonked in it. Everything is holistic.
Yes. I mean, I think what's the word? Synergy, the two elements make up more than the sum of their parts through doing it that way, right? Like, the performers are key, but then the way that lighting and placement and set design and costuming actually kind of enhance and kind of so they create a context and enhance what the actors are doing. I think it's just beautiful. And actually the Jared Leto character is the one that made me think of that, right? Because of his eyes and his hair, and actually just his house and the way that that's visualized.
I was going to say that the set within which, or the world, the building within which he lives, this kind of giant, it recalls very much that kind of sort of sci-fi updated Egyptian sort of tomb architecture. So he's living within this kind of elaborate, enormous, ostentatious Egyptian pyramids.
Yes.
As this kind of pharaoh, but he doesn't. Who's around him really? He again is isolated.
Yes. I want to say also that for me the film, one of the things that we don't often talk about is, films work partly if, on the grounds that they succeed in eliciting particular emotions from you. So on the one hand, I found the film really moving. I just found it very moving. It has moments that are just like really funny and smart, right? Like the scene where Deckard and Joe are running away and Joe just goes straight through the wall, right? I mean, that's funny. It
has a couple of jokes.
Yeah. And then there are moments that really tense me up, like with Jared Leto's assistant, when she crunched the Robin White character, I thought that was like really, it startled me, right? I jumped out of my seat. So, it kind of elicits all of those different feelings, and yet it's also, so it's very pleasurable in that way. It's beautiful to look at, and I think it's also one of those films that I want to see again, just because I feel, you know, like I haven't that has got much more to offer me actually.
It's a film that I can bathe in. I want to bathe in it. It's so feels so rich and dense, despite in some respects being quite minimalistic. Like there are a few characters per scene, and sets are very often very bare, but it's beautiful and feels rich and deliberate and so well considered.
The thing that you mentioned about the images is very interesting, because the images often feel simple in the sense that, you know, it'll be composed of a few elements,
yes.
right? But actually, those elements are combined to create something that is A, beautiful, and B, complex, right? That it has kind of a symbolic meaning. It stays with you, and sometimes it kind of creates patterns that recur later on. Like, they're very purposeful. And your eye can rest on them. It's not busy. There's not a million things going on. You actually can pay attention. One of the things that we haven't mentioned, and that I'd like
to get going in a minute, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, it's, you know, the last thing that I'd like to mention is the fantastic use of 3D.
Yes.
It's the only 3D that I've seen that doesn't feel intrusive. Actually, for a long time in the film, I wasn't aware that I was watching 3D, right? It feels so coherent, right? And then there are moments, obviously, where you see it and you realize how well used it is. It actually does add another dimension, but not with things jutting at you, not with, you know, your contemplation and immersion in what's happening, which is very great in this film. It doesn't disrupt that. Right?
I would say for sure that the idea that 3D is used to have things come out the screen is so rare these days. People have learned that is destroys the illusion of the film. So basically, since Avatar, maybe a couple of years before that, the film 3D has been used to go into the screen as opposed to out of. This film does it as beautifully as anything I've done. There are certain shots. Most shots, I agree, actually, you don't really notice it, and I don't think there'd be an awful lot of difference between the 3D and 2D versions. But there is just it gives a layer of an element of depth, an element of solidity to some of the world. Like when you see a kind of expanse of the world through a window from a high room. You feel it, you know. You don't really notice it, but you feel the expanse of nothingness.
Yes.
For the isolation. Particularly, I'm thinking of when when Joe goes to meet Harrison Ford, and they're just on their own in this isolated kind of radioactive hellhole, and there's just an expanse, and you feel it. Then there are just a few shots where you really notice it, where things are built in layers, where there's rain hitting a window right in front of you that distorts everything behind it, and it's a shot that would work perfectly well. It's a shot that's taken from noir, basically, people shot through a rainy window, but the depth of then Robin right behind the window, and then Joe further behind that, you sense it, and you feel it, and again it's beautiful and evocative, and so it's corporeal, you know. It's a real pleasure. Again, you bathe in it.
Another thing, and then we really must end, is you have to watch this on a big screen.
Yes,
it will not be the same
in
on
the
a small
IMAX
screen, right? Like, it just won't. So don't kid yourself. Go to the cinema.
Yes, exactly. There is one final thing, which is the one thing I wanted to mention about Jared Leto, which is that if he's meant to be a big villain, he's a letdown. He is interesting, but there is this kind of idea on top of everything that the reason that people are going after, you've got the police going after the child because they're like, we need to keep order, and this will destroy the world if people find out that replicants can have children, which makes sense. But that's where Joe comes in, because he's a Blade Runner, so he works for the police. You have this other idea, which is that the corporation, which is not the Tyrell Corporation anymore, it's this different corporation that's taken over, who Jared Leto's in charge of, they want to track down the kid because he wants to take over the stars. He wants to build... he wants to create millions and millions of replicants, and he can't do that with conventional technology. If they can reproduce themselves and be controlled, then all of a sudden we can explore the stars and take over the universe, essentially. Which makes sense, but it feels a little bit of a tacks on sort of supervillain plots, which not very much is made of.
No, I didn't see it that way. I mean, and maybe that's something to think about.
I think it's also partly because Jared Leto is in these two scenes and he's isolated from everything else.
Yeah.
There's no sense that he's going to meet...
I think in many ways, the villain of the piece is Leto's assistant.
Yes.
Right?
But she's
which
acting
for a large
him.
part of the film, I thought might end up being Joe's twin.
Okay.
Right. So I think the film has all kinds of interesting complications, and he's just a part of it. He's the kind of the new creator, really.
Yes. There's this wonderful image where a new replicant new product is dropped onto the floor out of this kind of plastic bag. It's wonderful, and she's covered in this gloop, which it's not gloopy, it's not liquidy, but it's
like
more
placenta or
it's
something.
like clay. It's like that residue you get on clay after forming it. And I thought, oh my god, this is beautiful. And then fucking Jared Leto's character actually says the word clay, and I'm like, oh well, there goes my brilliant thing that I noticed.
I'd say it wasn't clay. To me, it's like the fluid. The what do they call it? Amniotic fluid or whatever that you
Amniotic.
get. Amniotic fluid.
But that's the point. It's more solid than that. That's why I thought this is the residue that's left on wet clay after you've sculpted it.
No, I don't think
that's
so.
That's really what it looks like.
I think actually that's something that you see in many other. You see that in The Matrix as well. No.
Yeah, I'm telling you, I'm not. I don't mean to get too het up about this, but there's something more solid to it. It's not just gloop, which is what you get in The Matrix.
Well, it's J-lube is what it is, and I think it's meant to have the connotations of amniotic fluid because actually, she's dropped from a sack.
Yeah.
So it's the amniotic fluid that's kind of, it's like when newborn babies, they've got to be like clean.
Well, I mean, actually, it's like the birth of an elephant or something where it's dropped literally onto the ground and goes...
Yeah.
It is very much like that, but I think the specific consistency of this material that she's covered with, this residue, is exactly like clay residue.
Well, I'm skeptical, but I'd be happy to see it again and kind of test that observation.
The reason that I'm particularly pissed off, like I say, is because Jared Leto, I thought I've noticed something here. What a wonderful thing to have interpreted. And then Jared Leto fucking says it.
Right.
I was pissed off.
Anyway, let's leave it here.
Yeah, I'm late for work.
Yeah.
What a wonderful film, honest to God. No, I mean I'm so satisfied with it.
Good.
Not like I had to prove something to me, but it's out of this world.
Yeah, well, good because you've been moaning for 2 days about how
it's so much better than Flatliners. I mean, proper sci-fi that means something and is
they're not even comparable.
Exactly. This is how it needs to be done. The
right.
fog and everything. There's a beautiful fog, the lights in fog and distant buildings with this.
Okay, shut up now. You've got to go to work.
I have to go to work. Oh, it's so good.